All right, well, we might get started. So good afternoon, all. Before we begin, I'd just like to, in the spirit of reconciliation, acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. I'm coming to you from Nipaluna, which is Hobart, in beautiful Litruwita, which is Tasmania, in case you didn't catch on to that. And I invite you to type into the chat where you are coming from. Well, thank you for joining us on the back of the Easter long weekend for another sector development webinar. It's no secret, it is a massive calendar this year, and it is so huge because we've aligned it to the national standards for volunteer involvement. So not only do we have our overview sessions each month, and we have our live case study each month with Kylie Elliott from the Sydney Children's Hospital Foundation, of which, if you haven't registered for the upcoming event on the 13th of April, I encourage you to register for that and at least get to find out how Kylie implemented each of the national standards. But we also have a suite of fantastic presentations that have been loosely dotted lined, if you will, to each of the national standards. And today we have Paul Muller from the Institute of Project Management talking to us about the value of volunteering, which I'm sure is no secret to any of you, the value that volunteering brings. But it's always great to have Paul come and present to us as someone who has worked with the Centre for way too long. I'm sure Paul will agree, and has absolutely been instrumental in digging into our state of volunteering report, and also having a look at the new state of volunteering report, which is slowly commencing at the moment, and we'd be looking to launch that at the end of the year. So without any further ado, I throw over to Paul Muller and welcome you to enter any questions you may have in the chat, or if you hang around at the end there, we'll have an opportunity for you to pick Paul's brain. Over to you, Paul.
Cool. Thank you, Clint, and thank you everyone for joining us. Excuse me. With your permission, Clint, I will actually share my screen as well, and I will start the presentation. I'll come back to that one later, just teasing what's going on. Is that the right, excuse me, is that the right view I've got up? Apologies, I still have a bit of a legacy cough from another dose of COVID I had a couple of weeks ago, so forgive me for that. So what I'd like to do today, if it's appropriate to do so, is rather than just have me talk non-stop for, 45 minutes or whatever, which I'm more than capable of doing, but what I'd like to be able to do today is actually invite you guys to be a little bit interactive with this. It's only a small group of us here so far today, so please feel free, if you are genuinely camera phobic, by all means stay anonymous and hidden from the group, but what I'd like to do is kind of include a bit of your interaction and feedback and show how it connects to the work we've done around the State of Volunteering report. So first of all, what I'd like to do is just run around quickly and introduce yourself, who you are, which organisation you represent, and I'd love to hear your best volunteering moment. I'll go first because it's my show and I'm allowed to. Basically, so my name's Paul Muller from the Institute of Project Management, as Clint introduced me just a minute ago. I've been working as a researcher in this space around the value of volunteering now for about 10 years or so. I'm pretty familiar with, so the first of these state of volunteering reports we produced for Tasmania was back in 2013, 2014, thereabouts. And since that time, we've sort of refined a methodology and been able to quite significantly influence particularly government in terms of different state governments around their approach to this. But my best volunteering moment was very recently prepared a report for the centre on multicultural volunteering. in New South Wales and looking at the experiences of people who identify with other cultures, not just the white Australians who look like me, and looked at their perspectives and experiences of volunteering. And I suppose the thing that, you know, really surprised me in that, having been a researcher in this space, like I say, for about 10 years, is just how little I still know about volunteering and how it goes on in our society. And even with my openness to the idea that there isn't just one perspective on volunteering, seeing other people express their own experiences and to be honest, frustrations with volunteering as it's sort of understood and delivered at the moment in New South Wales and Australia, was really eye-opening for me. I've been fortunate enough to volunteer in a number of capacities over the years, particularly around sports. But yeah, that was a most recent sort of volunteering moment that sort of struck me, just how little I still know about this space. So with that, I'll throw to, I can pick a name or you can volunteer yourself. Volunteering works in all circumstances. Someone else like to flick their camera on and say good day? We're all so shy. Kate, are you feeling brave? Oh, here we go. We've got Subriana. Is that how I say your name right?
Yes, you're saying it correctly. My name is Subriana Keperu. I am the volunteer coordinator for 826 Shy, a nonprofit in Chicago that funds English and language arts skills amongst under-resourced communities.
Wow, that's awesome. What's been the highlight of your experience with volunteering today?
I would say a highlight of my volunteer experience is being able to reconnect, like go back to places that I volunteer and feel comfortable and still feel in the know, despite the amount of time and frequency between visits.
I was at a conference recently where we were talking about, people were talking about volunteering in the metaverse, and they were sort of trying to understand if that was going to be a thing or not. And it was just such a basic revelation that occurred to me at that time, is this idea that volunteering is how communities organise. So whether that communities in real life or in, in a metaverse or fake situation, volunteers still need to exist to make those communities happen. And that community thing coming through in terms of what you said, I love the fact too that I can return to communities that I've, geographically moved away from, or sort of, moved away from just from different stages of life you go through and stuff like that. But you still feel that connection to those that you volunteered with in the past, and be able to, feel good about, some of the work you've done. So yeah, that's an awesome insight. Thank you, Subriana. Yeah. Kate, what about yourself?
Hi everyone, Kate Bowman from Palliative Care, New South Wales. So we have a volunteer support services program. So I don't directly have volunteers underneath me, but we support services that have volunteers. I've done a lot of volunteering myself though, and my best volunteering moment is probably anytime, like, you realise so many things would not happen if it wasn't for volunteers making it happen. Like everything from, I don't know, the school putting on a fundraising fete to, kids, like little kids play group classes, well, not classes, but get-togethers every week. Like, just the whole world would stop, I think, if there weren't volunteers making things happen for communities.
And that's been a very motivating factor in this research. Excuse me, I'm an economist by trade, and one of the phrases we use all the time when we're looking at the impact of a certain activity or event or whatever that is we use the phrase "but for." And so, but for volunteering, this service, this thing wouldn't exist. It might not be wholly maintained or run by volunteers. There might be some paid, some volunteers. But if it wasn't for the volunteers, but for those volunteers, we just wouldn't have this service at all. And all these services and, things that are created and enabled by volunteering, they all contribute to our quality of life. either directly as a recipient of an act of volunteering. So someone who is in the last stages of life, obviously in palliative care environments, the volunteers make a very observable difference to their quality of life, I imagine. But it sort of goes through everything, whether it is through school fundraising, whether it is through faith-based volunteering, whether it's through, communities helping new migrants, for example. And, Subriana's example a second ago, helping people with literacy. I did a project for, a state-run adult literacy service, looking at the value of that a few years ago. And again, the thing, like the program, was heavily state funded. There were paid employees sitting behind it. But if it wasn't for volunteers, the program wouldn't have existed at all. And there's so much to do. And that's what this research is an effort to do, to actually quantify that contribution so we can get in front of policy decision makers and say, hey, we do need investments in roads and hospitals and schools and all of these things. But if we invest a little bit in volunteering and make that a real thing, we can actually make some massive differences. We get that force multiplication effect by having, that bit of motivating investment, the volunteers run with it, and we create so much value in the community. And that's what I'll get into a bit today. So yeah, thank you, Kate. That's really cool. Excuse me again, sorry. Was there anyone else wanted to say g'day before we got into it?
Hi, I'm Kate Murray. I currently work for Reach Out, which is a youth mental health online community, and our volunteers are youth peer support workers. My best volunteering moment, I think, was in my last position as a centre coordinator at Lifeline. I guess during the start of all the lockdowns with COVID, we were classed as essential workers. So it was such a great community that we built in our Lifeline Centre, where we were not only connecting with all the callers, because we had a huge increase of calls during that period, but connecting with each other and just having a real buzz and a shared purpose around the centre was incredible. It's a period I'll never forget. We didn't get to bake any sourdough or anything like that. We'll flat out, but it was a really special.
You didn't release a single that went viral on YouTube? Yeah.
Right, yeah. And I also volunteer. I still volunteer at Lifeline as well. So yeah, that's me.
Yeah, that's cool. And that's one of the things the volunteering sector is very good at, is telling stories and sharing stories of how volunteering made a difference. And the point of this research wasn't to try and replace those stories with numbers. It was really trying to show how, like, these stories and all these individual acts and these individual experiences actually come together to create a huge amount of value, that if we were in a position to cash it in, this is what it'd be worth. And when you compare it against, other projects that are going on and other ways governments spend money, it's an important thing and a significant contribution. One of the things too, Kate, with this, we actually looked very specifically at youth experiences of volunteering. One of the things I still hear going around talking to, people involved in volunteer management is the youth aren't volunteering. They're not volunteering at the same rates. Youth volunteering is much lower than current, than sort of older people volunteer and stuff. So that was one of the questions we went into this research with. A very open question was, how do youth volunteer specifically compared to the rest of society? So if you haven't seen the answers to that yet, Kate, we'll reveal them shortly. Anyone else want to say good day before we move on?
I'm
Sarah.
Yeah, I'm Sarah. Sorry, I've got COVID today, so I'm I'm at home. That's why I've got my camera on.
That's okay. Don't give it to the rest of us. Okay.
No. Yeah. So I work at Sydney Children's Hospital Network in palliative care, and so I've got lots of stories. Speaking of that, and mine are very story based. It's hard to sort of pick one, but just a recent one I had was, we've just started a biography program recently, and I had a volunteer call me after a particularly grueling session, I think, where the patient recalled her whole kind of, cancer journey. And anyway, I sort of debriefed her, and then I thought I better check in with the mum and make sure that they're okay as well, because it sounded like it was quite intense. And so I rang the mother and had said, oh, how are you going? And she said to me, she said, we went through all of that. And then when the volunteer left, I was able to say to my daughter, my goodness, what, look at your courage and your bravery in all that you've been through. We are so proud of you. And she said, I never would have had that opportunity if it wasn't for this process of sitting down and writing down the whole thing. So I thought, that's the sort of thing, isn't it? Like that depth of benefit from a process that's, a volunteer led. It's pretty profound and pretty amazing. So but I often have stories like that. I think, it's so incredible.
Look, it's one of those but-for moments, and one of the things about this too, I think, which is really interesting, is the idea that if the volunteer didn't, sit down and take the sharing of that story, the mum would have missed out, but she would have never known she missed out. So it wouldn't have occurred to her, perhaps until after a child had passed, that she'd missed that opportunity or something. So it's really difficult to and there's limits to what I can do in my research as an economist in this space. You cannot put a dollar value on something like that, such a transformative experience. But that said, we should still make an effort to quantify these things, because again, that's the way policy decisions are made in society. And it's stories like that make me realize just how, even with the value that we put on it, which is literally the next slide I'm going to show, how that's a horrible undervaluation of of what's actually created and enabled by volunteering. So well aware of the limits in our space, and I was feeling rough after sort of talking to Kate a second ago about working in palliative care in New South Wales. Working palliative care in a children's hospital, that's got to be about as intense as it can get. So and I'm in awe of the volunteers who can give in those environments as well. So thank you, Sarah. And sorry if you COVID, it does get better. I said, I had it a couple of weeks ago. But
yeah, it should be right for winter now anyway.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Hopefully, I'm immune for a good 6 to 12 months.
Yeah.
At least after that. Yeah. But my first time I got it was actually the people at the Centre for Volunteering who gave it to me. It was at the New South Wales State Conference last year.
No.
But I got my first dose of COVID just after all the travel restrictions were lifted. So seems to be a recurring theme here.
Yeah.
But I understand why you're not going into work too.
Yes, thank you.
Kim, did you want to say good day before we moved on? It's okay if you don't, Bono, that's fine as well.
Paul, Kim's left a message in the chat. She's got no video or audio at the moment, but details are in the chat. Volunteering in the Hunter region in the hospitals, which included the Pink Ladies and the Maroon Men, pastoral carers and consumer representatives. Most proudest moment recently was when our consumer reps were responsible for getting Maitland Hospital a license for the MRI, which was provided when we opened the hospital in 2022.
That's impressive, isn't it? It's amazing what a mobilised community can achieve that, as an organisation, you just may not have had the resources or energy to direct towards. A motivated community of volunteers is, it can be an incredibly powerful force for good. That's awesome. Cool. All right. Well, I'll do my big reveal in the next slide. The actual value of volunteering to New South Wales was 127 billion. Now we've got a guest from the US here, to put that into context, 127 billion Australian dollars is probably about 85 billion US dollars. And that's in a state of, someone correct me, about 7 million people in New South Wales, roughly. So, it's huge. The actual, return on investment we found was, when you look at every dollar that individuals, organisations and governments spend on their volunteering, it was about a 3-to-1 return on investment. So if you could, take, a dollar and gamble it and be guaranteed of getting $3 back every time you put your dollar down, that's a pretty healthy return, and you'd be making that bet every day. And that's what investments in volunteering return. They're quite significant. And as I was stating before, that's a real underestimate of the value. So when we say $127 billion, that's, using some very, very conservative, grounded economic theory to arrive at that. There's plenty more we could use to pad that number out. We just don't have to. We can use the most basic of economic theory to arrive at that number. So yeah, that's significant. That's every year. That's an annual return on investment. So I'm going to throw it around the room again, and we'll share a link to the report as well, which gets into the detail of how those numbers are arrived at, some of the breakdowns by different sectors of the community and stuff. What I want to ask in the first instance, and just very quickly around the room, throw it in chat if you like, or jump on camera. What are some of the barriers to people volunteering with the organisations you represent? Clint, if you see, come and chat and shout them out for us. But as someone, what prevents people volunteering or volunteering more for your organisation? I'd love to hear people's thoughts. Someone wants to jump on?
Definitely the paperwork, red tape processes to get a volunteer in, and and particularly going back to multicultural Westmead, I work across Westmead and Randwick, but Westmead in particular is a very diverse, has a very diverse patient population, and I feel that volunteers with second languages and different cultural and religious backgrounds would just be so beneficial. And yet it's hard because everything's sort of geared to having English as a first language to cope with all the information and the paperwork and the everything else. So that's a continual frustration for me.
Yeah. And one of the challenges, we get the intent behind some of the paperwork. Like, it's important that people understand their role, that they're safe to work in the environment and everything like that. So the intent is generally sound, but the execution is generally quite complex and bureaucratic and gets in the way and stops people wanting to become involved. And that's definitely a frustration we see across all sectors, but I imagine in a space like yours where you're working with children, you're working with vulnerable people as well, it must be quite heavy. And especially where you're looking for people who for English isn't necessarily their first language, where their skills are even in more demand, or their time or services even in more demand. That's a complicating, a compounded barrier again, sort of thing. So no, cool. What have we got in chat, Clint?
We've got no time and COVID, which made it extremely difficult for people to be able to do volunteering away from the facility where patient comfort is their main role.
Yeah, absolutely. If the volunteering depends on that personal contact. And I think of Sabriana doing the literacy type programs and stuff. Sitting side by side with a kid is a lot different to working with them on Zoom, which is a lot different to trying to do like a classroom full of them on Zoom or something like that. And chances are they're in need of those services in the first place because they haven't responded to classroom environments or the type of environments that are available to them. So, yeah, this survey that we did was actually conducted, all that data collection was actually conducted during a period of lockdown in COVID. So as a result, our findings may be slightly biased by that. Which is why we're actually doing another study very shortly, and I'll talk about that at the end of today. Anything else, Clint?
We've just had Kim come back and say we also have issues with volunteers with different cultural backgrounds, but do have two who have their issues relate well to the patient, if I've got that right.
Yep.
Yeah, so certainly the cultural background is a barrier as well. Hearing is the word. Two who have hearing issues and relate well to the patient. So yeah.
No, that's trying to get the most out of one of the things. And when we did the survey of volunteers in our multicultural survey, which is done recently, one of the big things we found is for bilingual multicultural volunteers, people who spoke English as well as their native language with a degree of fluency, burnout was the biggest thing. That was preventing them volunteering more. Wasn't a factor in the results I'll show in a second, but burnout was a big factor for them because their skills are so scarce because there are structural barriers to people like them coming into the volunteering workforce, and that their skills are in such high demand. A challenge is sort of balancing their very scarce and valuable skills with the over demand for them, the undersupply that they have. So another critical factor. Anything else before I sort of reveal the results of this survey, Clint?
Nothing else in the chat. Any else from anyone online?
Yeah.
I think you're right to reveal the result there, Paul.
The big results we found. So the volunteers, no time was a big one, and I think that was identified in the chat. Over half of people who are volunteering at the moment said a lack of time. They just don't have any more time to give. The costs of volunteering, the personal costs of volunteering, the personal financial costs we're talking there. One of the things we found is, and this is the first time research has been done like this, but people reach into their pockets quite heavily to subsidise their own volunteering, whether it's transport, whether it's materials and equipment, whether it's resources that they share with the people they're volunteering for, whether it's food, accommodation, those sort of things. It's actually quite expensive to volunteer. And in economic environments like we're in at the moment, where things are getting more expensive, that puts more strain on people's volunteering when they have to reach into their pockets so much to subsidise it. Health reasons, keeping in mind that this was taken during COVID, was a massive factor. People just not being sure how to volunteer more was also a thing, and a lack of access to transport was another big one. One of the things with our methodology too, we asked everyone, do you volunteer or not? Not obviously in quite as simple as terms as those, but we also had quite a large percentage of people who don't volunteer at the moment respond. And what we found for them, time was obviously a big issue for them. Health reasons was the next biggest factor for them, keeping in mind COVID. But one in four people just weren't sure how to volunteer, didn't know where to look, didn't know how to ask. And, that's those with no time or health barriers to volunteering, perhaps they're never going to, or not going to be able to while those circumstances are preventing them. But if 1/4 of the people who aren't volunteering, and that's 20% of society, we found in New South Wales, so roughly 80% of people were volunteering, 20% weren't. But if 1 in 4 of those people was just given access to it, that would, substantially bolster the volunteer workforce. 1 in 5 just not interested in volunteering, and that's fair enough. And costs were also a factor for this community too. So another question we asked was for people like yourselves, volunteer managers and the organisations they work with, what were the greatest greatest challenges their organised face at the moment? And again, I'll throw it to you guys. 2022 is a bit dated. We've moved on from 22. It's 23, and we're kind of in a post-COVID new normal at the moment, where people still get COVID, but it doesn't certainly disrupt society quite as much as it was 18 months ago. But for the organisations that you represent, what are the biggest challenges that you're facing at the moment? And then I'll go to sort of what our surveyed audience responded. So once again, either feel free to put it in chat or shout out. Love to hear from someone directly from the floor as well. And I'm fascinated by the US experience, Sabriana, if you'd love to contribute again. It must be quite late in the evening there for you, though. So, yeah. Got anything in chat or?
Just come through. Recruitment. Recruitment.
Finding volunteers.
Yep.
Finding volunteers in the first place. And that's a challenge. I think linking back to what we were talking before too about multicultural experiences and stuff, like finding volunteers who look like the people we are volunteering for is as much of a challenge. So I think, someone was saying before, I think it was one of our Kates, was saying, we're volunteering with Reach Out. It's a service for youth, and the volunteers are youth. So finding those volunteers who best align to the services you're trying to deliver can be quite challenging as well. So as they keep coming in, more than welcome to make contributions as we go. But financial viability, sustainability, so keeping the lights on and finding good governance. So those, the board of directors type people were the main sort of organisational challenges or issues that I think we had over 1,000 volunteer involving organisations respond to this survey and the questions we asked. We had the main issues relating to volunteers were, well, retention. Recruitment is one side of the coin, retention is the other. And again, keeping in mind that we did this during COVID, the health and safety of volunteers was a big issue for them. And then finally, for the external factors, access to things like funding and grants, which obviously links to financial viability and sustainability, as well as risk insurance and legal issues were seen as big threats. And again, the legal environment, there was just a lot of uncertainty around the legal environment for volunteering during COVID. Again, it'll be interesting to see when we rerun this survey whether that is still a big thing. But the cost of insurance has long been a real challenge for organisations who involve volunteers. How do we adequately protect ourselves and our volunteers and the people they're volunteering for through insurance schemes? So where these organisations wanted the support, we asked, what are the priority areas that you feel you could use support in? Volunteer management was absolutely the 1 in 3 responded to. Access to funding, grants or sponsorship. So where is the money that we can help access? Volunteer recruitment, which was mentioned before. And volunteer appreciation and recognition. So organisations, around 10% of organisations felt we don't do enough, or we could even use some help with recognising and appreciating our volunteers. And again, that goes back to, the storytelling and the for volunteers to be able to see the tangible impacts of their work, as with Sarah's story before, as with Sabriana saying, returning to communities that she'd volunteered with previously. Those are the sort of things that give you that sense of appreciation, recognition, and being welcomed back. Those sort of things. Ways to do that are things that as an industry, if you want to call volunteering an industry, I hate to use sort of capitalist terms to describe what is essentially volunteering, but volunteering as a sector, perhaps these are the things that these volunteer involving organisations, that's what VIOs stand for, identified. We've kind of touched on this already, but with organisations working with multicultural volunteers, But what does diversity in volunteering mean for your organisation? Really interested in what you guys might think of that. And I'll dive into a very specific aspect of diversity when we continue in a sec. Is it age? Is it gender? Is it people of different ethnic identities? Is it people with different physical abilities? Sarah?
I think it's all of those. Obviously, you know, there's all the main areas, religion, and
yep.
You know, for us, we have a lot of Muslim patients and families. Yes. So, you know, being respectful around that, and you know, that's why I would love to sort of match that. But you know, in other ways, you have to be respectful. I have one male volunteer,
Yep.
but when he applied, he said, "I'm finding that me being a male is a bit of a problem. Is that a problem for you?" So that was an interesting comment, and I said, "No, it's not a problem for me, but I have to tell you up front that I will have many families who will not have a male in their house, and that is a cultural thing. And, you know, so there may be a little bit of problem matching you with the family because there will be a certain percentage where you would be out as an option. That's not me. That's, you know, the way it is." So, you know, it's just being mindful of those sorts of things. But I also think I've got a great diversity in terms of personality and character. And when I match one family with one volunteer. So that's a big part of that, is having that diversity of personalities and life experience that can kind of really go well with a family or not. You know, I know that there are some that I might have in the right geographical area, and geography is a big challenge for me. Sydney's traffic is dreadful and it's very big. So I have a great problem with geography, but it's not, sometimes I'll have somebody in that area, but they're just so not a good match in terms of personality. So you know, that's a really big part of diversity as well.
It's interesting, really interesting you say that, because again, in all my, you know, and especially with the multicultural report, which I'll reference again in a sec, you know, when we think we do have maturing sort of like appreciations of diversity. It's no longer, you know, just about, you know, female representation on boards and stuff like that. We are recognizing that's a really diverse, you know, there's a lot goes into diversity. And in many respects, organisations and volunteer-involving organisations can't and probably shouldn't be perfectly diverse snapshots of our community, because they're servicing a particular interest or need or community that is kind of homogenous or very same looking in terms of the people it's serving. So sometimes that limits, as you know, the example you were saying with the gentleman who wanted to volunteer, but was limited by you know, cultural factors in terms of how we could do it. But you know, in all my discussion of this, we've never actually come across personality as a factor. But it's so true, isn't it? That, you know, especially where you're doing a very bespoke and intimate type service as a volunteer, personality's got to play a major factor. And you know, you're going to have very somber, serious people, very, you know, playful, energetic people who are, with a lot of generational wisdom, who really want to share, people who are much bigger, you know, listeners, for example. So yeah, that personality matching, I think, is a fascinating thing to throw on the mix too.
It's also, like, I do have some that I call my everymans, and they are the sort of volunteer who I could pretty much put with any family, and they'll adapt. They've got that ability to kind of adapt to whatever their environment is. But then there are others who I think don't have that, and I have to be much more careful when I place them that it's a good match. They just don't have that. They're just. But there are some who are very good at adapting to whatever family they have. They've just got that skill in being able to switch the way they communicate, just everything, you know, they're able to do that. and to give them what they need. But yeah, age is another big thing. Like some my young ones tend to do the sibling support because the siblings love having that young energy. But yes, if I've got a mum who really needs support, then obviously, you know, that life experience is what's needed. Yeah.
What they're craving. Yeah. Yeah. No, it'd be great if every volunteer was a Swiss Army knife like that. But it's also too not just matching obviously at the front of your mind is matching the volunteer so that the recipient of the volunteer's service gets the most value out of it. But you also want the volunteer themselves to have a good experience so that, you know, they can be reused. They stay with you. Retention being a major issue for organisations. If volunteers have bad experiences or, you know, suboptimal experiences, or their experiences don't match their expectations, then they're less likely to not only volunteer with you, but potentially walk away from volunteering in general to an extent, which is
absolutely. Yeah, that's right.
No, absolutely. Anything else in chat there, Clint?
Yep, we've got from Kim, for us, it's volunteers who have previously worked in health and those who don't. The people who have worked as nurses or in clinical roles are more difficult to manage as volunteers. They already know what to do, so we have to pull them back to understand the volunteers support comfort while staff support care. Yeah,
that's really interesting. You know, it's I'll share a similar story. One of the guys at our work was a professional football player, and in his youth, and was coaching his son's football team, like under 8s, under 9s or something. And his own kid who'd grown up with his dad and had that sort of drive and work ethic and talent as well. You know, he responded very well to that coaching, but he had to learn to adapt his style for the audience he was volunteering with. And sometimes, you know, one of the things we want volunteers to be able to do is bring their skill and expertise to a role. But we also, managing expectations and the limits within that can sometimes be just as challenging. A really interesting observation. One of the things, and just quickly before I move on to, when we talk about diversity and volunteering, one of the things we want to see, ideally, is that the diversity within our organisation is also represented among the decision makers. So if we've got predominantly youth volunteering, that they have input into how the organisation volunteers and how they grow, and so they get some sort of input into how the organisation operates and what it means in the multicultural sense. And we just did this report is, when you allow someone else to make decisions on behalf of your organisation, you're giving up power essentially to them. And that's quite challenging for some organisations to hand over, their knowledge and experience and trust others with decision-making responsibility. But people don't necessarily just want to volunteer. They may want to contribute, in leadership and decision-making as well. And that's something to consider in that role of inclusiveness. But as I indicated before, and I think I mentioned when Kate was introducing herself, we looked very specifically at youth volunteering in this research and sort of pulled youth out as a segment and said, well, how do they volunteer? Excuse me, sorry. I'm just going to take a drink of water for a sec. If you'll forgive me, I've left you there on a bit of a cliffhanger. It's like the end of a Netflix episode, isn't it? But yeah, youth are far more likely than adults to volunteer for a group, like a sports team, a creative group, or a hobby group. And that's that plus 28.2 means they're almost 30% more likely to volunteer for that sort of group than the rest of the population, the rest of the adult population. They're also more likely to volunteer for an organisation through advocacy, for example. So they're much more interested in volunteering to agitate for change. By creating or distributing media or influence. And they're also far more likely to volunteer for one-off events. For a festival, or if there's an emergency response, like, in Australia, bushfires or floods, or, natural disasters, or an issue such as a political, environmental, or social cause, which is linked to that. Advocacy. One of the things, and this is in formal settings, so formal volunteering is where we volunteer with an organisation. Informal volunteering is just that volunteering and contributing in the community without necessarily being associated. So again, youth compared with adult volunteers, youth were far more interested in just helping out in the community or teaching, coaching, giving practical advice. They were far less interested in things like transport or running errands, or personal care or assistance. Transport one was because of lack of access to transport, which was one of their big challenges. But one of the things, with aging populations, we talk about, crises in aged care. How are we going to find the people to necessarily fill and supplement the aged care workforce? Older Australians are far more interested and willing to do that sort of personal care and assistance than young ones. So we shouldn't necessarily, there's a lot of programs were going on around getting youth into aged care jobs, saying that's where the market is, but they actually have less of an appetite for it than older Australians. And the other thing that surprised me here is youth, by definition, don't have a huge amount of life experience to pass on as a teacher or coach or mentor. Yet that's what they're really interested in doing. They're really interested in applying their knowledge in a way that is shared with others and can help them out. And that was a bit of a surprising finding for us as well. In terms of the diversity of volunteering, and again, this is talking about youth, when it came to volunteering with organisations, those formal organisations, youth over the 12 months of the survey period typically volunteered for just over 3 organisations, whereas the rest of the adult population was only volunteering for 2. And they were much less likely to do informal. Well, actually, I shouldn't say much less likely. That's only just sort of sitting on the boundaries of significance within the margin of error. But yeah, less likely to be involved in formal volunteering or different types of informal volunteering. So, half of youth are motivated to give their time to develop new skills or gain experience, compared to 14% of volunteers. So if you can challenge youth in a way that they're learning and growing, and those skills that they acquire might be transferable to work or other spaces, that's what really motivates them to volunteer in a way that older volunteers just aren't interested in. So I thought that was an interesting finding. On the barriers side, youth were far more likely to say they had no time, that their time was limiting their ability to volunteer. They were far more likely, twice as likely or greater than twice as likely to say that the lack of access to transport was a barrier to volunteering for them. Health didn't bother them as much. Health wasn't as the issue that it was for older volunteers, although keeping in mind data skewed by COVID. But yeah, that no time being the main barrier was the real standout. So what that, one of the things we can infer from this is potentially if we can find one of the things when organisations ask people to volunteer, that traditional model of show up every week between 5:30 and 7:30 may not be as appropriate for youth as more flexible scheduling or even occasional event one-off type volunteering, which we indicated before was a preference for them. So that obviously comes with its own costs and risks. But in terms of engaging youth volunteers, this is what we found. The other thing as well, people were, this is the downward trend. So when we asked the volunteer involving organisations, like the organisations who are using youth volunteers, they felt that the number of youth who were willing to volunteer was less than what they'd seen in the previous 3 years. But they only offered about 1.5 different roles to volunteers to youth in the organisations. They just said these are the only roles that are available to youth, where youth expressed an interest or an appetite for diversity of roles in organisations. And that may be why, of those responding organisations, they found youth were volunteering less. And probably one other thing, we found youth compared to other volunteers were actually more optimistic about their future volunteering outlook. And this is potentially linked to the finding around time. They've got less time now, but potentially over the next 3 years, they saw themselves volunteering more as opposed to about the same. And they were far less likely to say that they're not volunteering at all. And there was a higher degree of uncertainty about their future volunteer intentions among youth as well, again, because of the barriers and potentially the COVID environment that was in their way. Now, Kate, you work a fair bit with youth volunteers specifically. How does this line up with your experience?
Yeah, I've only been in the job since October, but it is lining up. I think what particularly resonates with me is that that motivation about gaining skills, as well as providing support. But that seems to be a very common theme. And because the volunteering is all online and when you can fit it in, I think that flexibility works really well with what you've found in this survey as well.
Look, very interesting and challenge some of the ingrained perceptions that we found out there in the community. So you'll see in 2020 we asked people what their intentions were in 3 years from now, and 3 years from them is 2023, and we're actually at 2023 now, and feeling older for it. But the big what's next for us is we're running the report again. So we're about to go into data collection in a couple of months for this report again. And for the first time too, we're actually joining with the other states and territories in Australia as well. We're just getting, they're sort of gradually coming on board and signing up as we speak. And we're actually going to, for the first time, have a really true national picture of what volunteering might look like. And we'll be able to compare our 2023 results to the survey results then. And it'll be really interesting to see, state by state, but also nationally, what the volunteering landscape looks like right now. One other thing I'll show to you before we bounce and go to questions is the cost of volunteering calculator. Now, we prepared this for New South Wales for the Centre for Volunteering, but it meets the Australian accounting standards for working out how much, what the replacement cost of your volunteers might be. So if you had 10 volunteers aged 35 to 44, then, you got 10 hours of volunteering. So say you got 120 hours of volunteering per week out of people in that age bracket. If we had to pay them a market wage, that'd be $300,000. So this is quite a useful tool that's on the website. I'll drop the link in chat for the Centre for Volunteering. This, if you are putting together, grant applications or stuff, or funding applications, or you're speaking to stakeholders about the value that's created by your work, replacement cost isn't the only way we measure value. And again, I encourage you to visit this site so that you can see the actual full report. This is where you can download it actually. Sorry, I need to get things out of the way so I can click on the right things. State of Volunteering report. I'll drop this in the chat as well, but that's where you can download the full report. I'm available pretty much at any time through the centre if you have questions about the methodology or how we've gone about things. They got this ugly bloke to present on it as well. I'm surprised they ever asked him back. But before we bounce now, we've got a few minutes. If anyone has any questions about what we've looked at and what we've done.